Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Did you know cats tend to hide symptoms of sickness and pain? I learned this the hard way after losing my cat, Gingy. So I created Pretty Litter, a health monitoring litter that helps detect early signs of illness by changing colors, saving you money and potentially your cat's life. Pretty Litter is veterinarian developed, and it's the easiest way to keep tabs on your fur baby's health right at home.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleon Assist. It's the 15th of June, day 11 of Waterloo Remembered, and the first day of the Waterloo campaign. Today we're looking at the mechanics of war and the three systems of command at Waterloo, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Dr. Will Fletcher from King's College London. Will, how are you?
Hi, Zach. Very good, thank you, and thanks for inviting me on. Looking forward to talking about all things Waterloo today.
Tell us a little bit about your research.
So I've just finished my PhD a few months ago, looking at the British Army's staff system during the Napoleonic Wars, and basically looking at how headquarters worked, not just in Wellington's army, but across the British Army during the period, and things like military education and patronage, and basically how specifically the Quartermaster General's Department became the operations branch of the British Army staff system during the period. And that's basically what my PhD research has been on.
You're turning that into a book, aren't you?
Yes, that's the current plan. Just looking now at sending off book proposal to publishers to try and get it turned into a book. And one of the things with the book proposal is actually adding a chapter on the Waterloo campaign. So I'm just starting to look into the Waterloo campaign. My PhD ended in 1814, so I'm now just adding on another year to the British Army's experience and looking at the Waterloo campaign. So that's quite relevant for today's discussion, I think.
It absolutely is. Fantastic. And people can follow you on Twitter, can't they?
Yes, that's right. I'm 1815 Fletcher, so try and post as regularly as I can about my research and keeping a foot of all things Napoleonic. So yeah, people can follow me on there.
Fantastic. If you're not following Will already, you definitely should be. Now, each of the three armies at Waterloo had quite different characters in command of them in the form of Wellington, Blucher and Napoleon. How do you think their respective personalities influenced the way in which the campaign unfolded? Because Napoleon's initial plan strikes me as kind of the classic inspired manoeuvre that nobody's expecting, which ironically is sort of exactly what Napoleon was known and feared for.
Yes, no, it's a big and interesting question about the three personalities. I mean, the way I see it, their personalities really lend themselves to three important things. Firstly, their style of command and leadership, which is obviously different between the three. Secondly, their understanding of what exactly they were trying to achieve during the campaign and their motivations for the campaign. And thirdly, feeding into that is their sort of concept of operations of how they were actually going to fight this campaign. So starting with Napoleon, his style of command was very much sort of authoritarian, but he was certainly charismatic. But I think importantly for this campaign, he was sort of feared by his subordinate commanders about wanted to sort of dictate decision making, and this particularly became an issue during this campaign at the operational level, where commanders were obviously fearful and had to have Napoleon's final approval on decisions they made. In terms of his aims for the campaign, he obviously was on a personal level trying to secure his dynasty and, hopefully, bring peace and end the War of the Seventh Coalition as quickly as possible to try and regain his position in France. So with that in mind, his sort of concept for operations was very much his old classic Napoleonic style of things, using the core system, being operationally flexible, creating battle at a decisive point and using his reserves. And his idea would be for in the Netherlands theatre to basically try and assemble 6 army corps plus cavalry reserve corps in that theatre to overwhelm the Allied armies that were operating in Belgium, and basically do this through manoeuvre, concentration of force, and above all speed. And then once in that theatre, he'd use his famous strategy of the central position to achieve local superiority and hopefully defeat both of those armies in detail, and staff work would obviously be key to that. So that was sort of Napoleon's, how his personality and understanding of the war, I think, were important for the campaign. And then, so moving on next to Wellington, obviously his style was slightly different to Napoleon's, and he was more respected and trusted, both by his men, but also by the political leaders of the day that were asking him to once again take command of not only the British main field army, but also Allied armies attached to it. And in terms of his style at headquarters, he was dominant at headquarters, but he wasn't as dictatorial as Napoleon was. But he certainly ran things and kept a close eye on staff work, for example. In terms of his aims and understanding for the campaign, obviously he'd been part of the sort of the Congress of Vienna and understood the nature of the coalition war that was being fought. And he was essentially waiting for the Austrian and Russian armies to appear, and along with the Prussians were waiting in Belgium before launching their attack. And traditionally, the British sort of strategic situation of defending the sort of Scheldt estuary was very much something that he had in mind. And he was obviously worried himself famously about Napoleon imposing a different strategy of manoeuvre, that of the indirect approach and cutting his lines of communication. And that was obviously something that people will be well aware of. And his sort of Wellington's concept of operations was he was essentially, before the campaign, waiting to go on the offensive, ideally, but he was able to be defensive if necessary. And obviously he'd be working with allies, most closely to him, the Prussian army. But he knew this would be a war working with allies, which he was used to doing in the peninsula, working with the Spanish armies, and also obviously the integrated Portuguese army. And then moving on to Blucher, his style of command was very charismatic, in a sort of similar way to, I guess, Napoleon. He was a charismatic leader, and known as a Hussar general, famously Marshal Forwards, he was known as. But I think something that a lot of people often overlook, or when they play up the Hussar narrative a bit too much, is that Blucher was a serious military scientist, and he'd been very influential in the reforms of the Prussian army after the defeat at Jena-Auerstadt in 1806. And that feeds into the sort of staff element of that, and he was very influential in all of that. So he wasn't just a leader that wanted to, even though that was a big part of his motivation for fighting, to get to grips with the French, but he was also a serious military scientist, and that's something I was looking at in my PhD, as a sort of part of the Prussian rise in their staff system, and Blucher was an important figure in that. And his aims, obviously, again, were working with the Allies to defeat Napoleon, but also the Prussian idea of trying to have a better standing in sort of European situation. Congress of Vienna, obviously before the 100 Days campaign, Prussia had very many issues that it felt wasn't being heard by the other allies at the Congress of Vienna. And so from a Prussian point of view, Blucher was keen to show that Prussia was a key player in defeating Napoleon this second time around, and that obviously feeds into future debates of the Congress of Vienna. And like Wellington, his concept for operations was hoping to go on the offensive when the other allies join them, but prepared to work in the defensive if necessary. And obviously, as the campaign unfolds, Blucher is famously very loyal to Wellington and the Allied cause, trying to keep the armies together. So I think that's a key thing that comes out in the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say about motivation and the different ways in which each of those commanders interacted with their men. Because as you say, Blucher and Napoleon seem to be much better at connecting with their men on a personal level. Wellington famously said that Napoleon himself was worth 40,000 men on a battlefield because of the inspiring impact that his presence had and the fact that his men would fight much more harder. But then Wellington said of himself that when he pitched up at the crisis points in a battle, the men would fight in a way that they wouldn't normally fight because they knew and trusted him as a commander who always put himself in the point of greatest danger. And yet Wellington was unashamedly kind of aristocratic, quite kind of snobbish, really, in his views about the rank and file. So they think about their men very differently. And yet, for all that Wellington might have called his men the scum of the earth for a variety of reasons that we won't go into, but not necessarily just because of his view of their social status, Wellington was much more frugal with his men's lives, as opposed to Napoleon, who famously said that he wasn't particularly bothered about the losses, provided he achieved his objective. What's your sense about how that influences and kind of balances out over the course of Waterloo?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question about their attitudes to their men's lives. And obviously, there's a lot being done on this in terms of Napoleon having an understanding of the amount of, thousands of conscripts he had coming in each year that he could use for fighting wars in this sort of blasé way. He fought wars that, he didn't seem to care too much about casualties. And I think one of the interesting things in terms of Wellington's view comes back to this idea about him being a defensive general, in terms of, yes, he wanted to preserve the lives of his men. And I think that is certainly true. And throughout the Peninsula War, you see various measures or during various campaigns where he's either upset about losing large numbers of men, but also, as much as possible, in an operational sense, he's trying to preserve their lives and not take any unnecessary risks. But I think in terms of being defensive general, that's not exactly the same thing. And often he saw the offensive as a good way of, achieving what they needed to do, and there may be casualties. But obviously Waterloo's really instilled this myth that he was defensive general that liked to, shelter his troops behind the reverse slope. Whereas in the Peninsula, there's only various occasions where this sort of happens. Wimmera, obviously, famously, and Bazarko, and then later on, maybe Sauron. But it's not a sort of general tactic that Wellington uses on a regular basis, whereas Waterloo, he obviously does use this, and he wants to protect his men, and they lie down behind the ridge, etc. And that's obviously a sensible precaution, but it's not just because he wants to protect his men, he's always a defensive general. So I think the two things are sort of different issues, which is quite interesting how historians have often written up Wellington as being defensive, mainly just to protect his men.
Let's talk about the staffs specifically, because a good staff officer has to deal with the personality of their commander as well as doing their job well. Starting with the individuals, first of all, who were the principal staff officers within the respective armies during this campaign?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a very interesting point, this, because during this period, and what my PhD was looking at was how this so-called scientific approach to war developed across all the European militaries during this period, and how there was this partnership really between a chief of staff, by whatever name that might be. For example, in the British Army, it's the Quartermaster General. In the French Army, it's normally known as the Major General, but translated, as chief of staff. And again, with the Prussians, really have Quartermaster Generals and then chiefs of staff. So there's a central partnership between commanders and their chief of staff, and how you translate a commander's concept of operations and his art of war into actually executing them in reality, which is more where the science of war comes in, of how you move troops around in a sort of operational science rather than sort of technical science of artillery, which is a slightly different type of military science. But for the actual Waterloo campaign, each of the three commanders actually really has their B team of chiefs of staff, and all three of them don't really have the person they would have ideally had in that position. So famously, first of all, Napoleon and his famous chief of staff, Berthier, is not obviously at the campaign, and there's a whole sort of story there about why he wasn't present. I mean, he died before the battle itself, but long before that, he could have been employed by Napoleon to be his chief of staff, but wasn't. So it wasn't just a case that he died, but he hadn't
Didn't he refuse?
been appointed to that position. Yes, well, this is the thing. So I think, having sort of looked into it, obviously he does, there's this thing about whether he's assassinated, etc. But I think Berthier, being sort of very honourable man, and not just Berthier, but a lot of the French hierarchy have obviously pledged their allegiance to the French monarchy when it's restored. And I think he sits very uneasy with this idea of switching back to Napoleon after having done that, even though he'd served him from 1796 as his chief of staff all the way through. But he just sat very uneasy with this idea of Napoleon escaping and all the drama that had caused in France. So yeah, he'd refused to serve Napoleon. And this left Napoleon in a very difficult situation in terms of who to employ instead, because essentially Berthier, yes, had done this job for Napoleon really, really well over the years, but equally there wasn't anyone. Berthier had been so dominant that there hadn't really been a protege trained up to take over. There was obvious, I mean, there was lots of people in his staff, but also Berthier being a marshal, that automatically meant that one of the other marshals would have to fill that position rather than some more junior officer who may be actually better placed to actually execute that sort of role. It had to be a marshal. So famously, Marshal Soult is appointed. And in terms of his experience, I mean, Marshal Soult has fought against Wellington in the Peninsular War, and relatively effectively, knows his enemy. I mean, interestingly, he's dined with Wellington during the peace in between, and he knows his sort of adversary. But in terms of his attributes as a chief of staff, it turns out to be fairly catastrophic appointment. And obviously, with hindsight, it's easy to say that, but I think even Napoleon would hopefully admit that it was a bit of a risk putting Soult in that position early on, when others may have potentially done well. But at the end of the day, the main problem was Berthier wasn't present.
Wasn't Suchet a potentially more obvious choice?
Yeah, Suchet's, and obviously Suchet had been a very effective marshal, down on the east coast of Spain, and he'd proved himself very well. And that would have been probably a logical choice. But as I say, I think it's interesting. I've read quite a lot about sort of alternatives. I'm sort of going to sit on the fence in terms of there wasn't really an alternative to Berthier, because no one had done that role for any length of time. So in some ways, the weakness was no one was ready to step in. I mean, say Berthier had been killed in an earlier campaign, that would have also been an issue, I think, of organising the army. And I think another important point isn't just the practicalities of staff work and organising the army, but Berthier, his real strength was knowing how to interpret Napoleon's ideas, and also knowing when to sort of ignore unnecessary sort of flicking of ideas in a campaign, and trying to keep everyone informed what was going, keep everyone sort of focused on the objective, rather than, as we see during the 100 Days, there's lots of changes of decisions, there's lots of comings and goings and difficulties, which if Berthier had been there, he'd have been much more controlling the situation, rather than Soult trying to be very reactionary to everything that was happening, either from Napoleon or from the subordinates. And one other brief thing on Napoleon's sort of the key personalities. Napoleon, I mean, another issue really is the command system that's in place for the campaign, because he has this, obviously there's the famous corps system that's been in place and used by the French very effectively. But for this campaign, he has Ney and Grouchy, who aren't actually in command of a corps themselves, and are basically in this middle level between Napoleon's imperial headquarters and the corps below them. And so they each get, attached different corps to deal with. But it was basically adding a new layer in between Napoleon and the corps system, which had actually happened previously. But that was a big problem, especially, you know, with an unfamiliar staff with salt. That this really had problems. And Ney, for example, famously had Jomini, famous military theorist, and as his chief of staff through the Napoleonic Wars, and Jomini wasn't there for Ney for this campaign, having switched sides. So Ney was also missing his chief of staff. And Grouchy had a fairly inexperienced chief of staff, in the sense of the French system was commanders would always keep their chiefs of staff with them. So whichever level they were working, they would take their chief of staff. So Grouchy, who is, you know, the most junior marshal, actually took a chief of staff who was fairly junior as well. But he then ended up directing a series of corps under him with a fairly junior chief of staff. So that was another sort of issue with the French system, was it wasn't the most experienced chief of staff stayed in position. It was commanders took their chiefs of staff with them. That makes sense. So that was the French system. But then other personalities, obviously with Wellington, as I was saying, this is a B team all around, because Wellington ideally would have had Murray as his chief of staff, or quartermaster general. But I mean, interestingly, Murray becomes the British Army's first chief of staff just after Waterloo, when they first appoint someone to that appointment. And clearly, you know, the quartermaster general throughout my whole PhD, that is what we these days identify as the chief of staff. That's the role, even though he's called the quartermaster general. But Murray's in Canada, because a lot of, obviously, famously regiments, but also personalities have been sent over to America and Canada. So Murray's obviously would have been the ideal choice, but he wasn't available to be back in time. And I think one of the important things here is the importance of Murray and the role of the chief of staff of Wellington, because various historians have sort of written about how Wellington was so dominant at headquarters, which is certainly true, but often people are too much into the side that Murray was, or the chief of staff was, basically just writing out Wellington's ideas, and whereas Murray was actually a crucial personality in the same way that Berthier was, in terms of actually making Wellington's ideas a reality. And yes, Wellington went into detail about various things like supplies and operational movements, but Murray was a key personality that actually made that all work. And it wasn't just a case of him being some sort of secretary that just wrote out his ideas. And this is shown, I think, really well in the retreat from Burgos, where Gordon takes over instead of Murray, and the whole system basically falls apart. And it shows how important that role was. It's not just a case of writing out Wellington's ideas. And Wellington famously said about he had a very, very inexperienced staff, but this was on the 8th of May, and there've been significant personalities that had turned up by the time of the Waterloo campaign and the following month. So yeah, I think, so basically Hudson Lowe was going to be his chief of staff, and luckily Wellington manages to get rid of Hudson Lowe, who would have been not very well experienced to fulfill that role under Wellington, and instead famously William Delancey takes the post, and he's a pretty good second person to have as a chief of staff instead of Murray. He's certainly a scientific, he's educated at High Wycombe like the rest of the scientifics, and he had very good experience. He served with Wellington all the way through the Peninsula from 1809 without going home once, and stood in for Murray on the 2 times he'd been home for sustained periods, and knew exactly how Wellington's system should work. It was a case of trying to recreate it as best as possible for the Waterloo campaign. And also just below Delancey, there were various other key personalities. Obviously, Rebec as the Prince of Orange's chief of staff, he was very experienced, but also Rebec had a British officer with him, Alexander Abercrombie, who'd been a very experienced quartermaster general in the Peninsular War. And I think he was key in terms of Prince of Orange's First Corps staff. Abercrombie was very well known with Delancey, and they worked very well throughout the campaign, along with Rebec, in terms of dealing with Prince of Orange's corps, which was crucial throughout the campaign. And then moving on to the Prussians. So Blucher, again, had his basically second choice of chief of staff in Gneisenau. His ideal choice would have been Scharnhorst, but he'd been killed in a cavalry charge at the Battle of Lutzen in 1813. But Gneisenau was a good replacement. He'd been a protege of Scharnhorst, who was a Saxon officer. And he'd really developed the Prussian staff system even since Scharnhorst's day, very much emphasising this idea more towards collective responsibility amongst the chiefs of staff in the Prussian system. And he'd been very effective in this in the campaign that led to Leipzig in 1813. So he was well experienced. And there's this sort of issue about him working with allies. He'd obviously had experience of this through the 1813 campaign and other campaigns. And obviously would have to work with the British this time, which is an issue about how well Gneisenau respected the British. But Scharnhorst, his big protege, I think it's really interesting, certainly did have a big regard for the British. Scharnhorst had worked with him in the 1790s campaign. And interestingly, during my PhD research, found that Scharnhorst had actually been asked to become the commandant at the new staff college at High Wycombe when Jarret, the first commandant, died, and the British were trying to get Scharnhorst to take over that post, which he considered, but then wanted to keep loyal to the sort of Prussian cause. And Gneisenau, similarly, both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau visited England more than one occasion, and they certainly had links with the British and the British sort of staff system and scientifics, and there was certainly a common bond in that sense. And at a lower level, the Prussians obviously had a whole system of chiefs of staff that they've been building on. And just one other one to highlight really is Clausewitz, who's Third Corps chief of staff, who aren't directly involved in Waterloo, but they're over at Wavre. But yeah, there's a series of good chiefs of staff in the Prussian system. But overall, I think between the three armies, it's a case of the B team of chiefs of staff of Soult, Delancey and Gneisenau. And I think one of the big factors of the campaign is who has the best B team. And I think it's certainly the Allies, and Napoleon really struggles without Berthier.
On a personal level, how well do Wellington, Blucher and Napoleon get on with their staff officers? Because that relationship is one of trust and mutual, or needs to be one of trust and mutual respect.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, Napoleon and Soult is obviously different to Napoleon and Berthier had been, so that's a real issue, because, Napoleon had very much understood that Berthier knew how to deal with him, and Berthier knew how to deal with Napoleon, so that was certainly strained between Napoleon and Soult. And we see this throughout the campaign of Napoleon sending off his own orders without even, telling Soult what he's doing. And that's a real issue, that there's not that personal trust there. So that's an issue. Wellington and Delancey is interesting. I think, obviously, Wellington understands the role of the Quartermaster General, which is something he actually struggles with to begin with in the Peninsular War, giving control to Murray. And he becomes painfully clear that he does have to give more control as his army gets bigger, especially. And with Delancey, he understands Delancey's role and how he needs to be used. But I think he realises also that Delancey isn't Murray, and there's quotes in the Peninsula where Wellington sees a few issues with Delancey, but throughout the campaign there is nothing obvious that particularly means that Wellington goes over the head of Delancey, so they work quite well together. And I think famously the Gneisenau-Blucher partnership is the strongest one in terms of how the Prussian system works, but also on their personal level and understanding of how that works. Blucher and Gneisenau work very much as a team, with one being very much the figurehead leader and the other one the chief of staff that makes things actually happen. So I think three quite different relationships between the three commanders and their chiefs of staff throughout the campaign, which again plays very much into the developments of the actual campaign itself.
Yeah, I mean, what's often not appreciated about military campaigns, and what you've highlighted quite clearly for us, is that behind every successful commander is a highly efficient staff system. What challenges did the staffs have of all the armies? Because they had to deal with very different issues over the course of their campaigns, because the campaigns sort of unfold in different ways and have to do different things depending on their relative strategic situations. Yeah, no,
that's a really good question. They each have different specific problems to deal with. I think on the sort of overall level, it's important again to emphasise how the staff system is actually working in terms of a lot of sort of or written historians that are quite dismissive of the idea of how the system actually works, in terms of it's almost as if commanders just write notes to their ADCs who then ride off and give them to another commander, which does occasionally happen, but most of the time it goes through the Chief of Staff and his operational staff, for example, in the British Army, the Quartermaster General's Department, and ADCs are obviously used as messengers, but each of them, to overcome all these problems that they have to deal with, have a sort of sophisticated system in place of the orders process, and that all relates to how do you translate commanders or concepts of operations into actually executing them, but also just the practicalities of moving large bodies of troops around the theatre, and all the staffs are really dealing with the Clausewitzian friction in war, which is famous in terms of issues that are unexpected coming up and having to overcome them. So for the French, Napoleon's staff and Assault are obviously trying to execute this strategy of the central position. I think what's particularly interesting with the French staff is they're actually very effective in the early stages of the 100 Days campaign, in terms of before the campaign launches, the invasion of Belgium. They actually managed from the 6th of June, they've actually assembled 6 army corps as well as escorting cavalry very effectively between the 6th and 14th of June, which the speed with which they managed to put them on the Belgian border takes the Allies by quite a big surprise. And so in a sort of strategic level, their staff work, I think they deserve quite a lot of credit for how that's managed. But when the campaign actually starts with the invasion of Belgium, and this strategy of the central position is actually trying to work to split the two Allied armies apart, that's where the staff really struggle to keep coordinating the different movements of the different army corps, and that's really where they struggle. For Wellington, taking Wellington and Blucher's armies together, they're very, initially intelligence is a bit of an issue for them. They know that Napoleon's joined his army and that an invasion is imminent, but I think interestingly from Wellington's point of view, he doesn't quite appreciate what the tempo of the campaign will be in terms of how fast Napoleon wants his army to move, and how fast, which I think the Prussians and any European armies had much more appreciation of. 1 minute you're sat in a position and the next minute everything's completely changed and Napoleon's sort of behind you, or split your armies up, or got in between you in a friendly formation, whereas Wellington in the peninsula had been fighting Napoleon's marshals, but he'd never come across this idea of how fast armies could potentially move if needed. Obviously Wellington himself moved very fast in the Vittoria campaign, and in the Pyrenees, again, things were moving very quickly. But I think going from a standing start, waiting for something to happen, I think that's a major issue. Is Wellington and his staff obviously have to suddenly up their own game to sort of try and keep pace with the tempo that Napoleon wants to fight this campaign with, which I think is really interesting. And I think for the staff work for the Allies, a key thing is obviously working together. So each of the Allied headquarters has the liaison officer for each other. So Muffling for the Prussians, who's with Wellington's headquarters, and Hardage, who's a scientific from the Quartermaster General's Department, who's with the Prussian headquarters, relaying British aspects. So the staff are basically trying to deal with working together and working out what Napoleon's going to do, because effectively the initiative is with Napoleon for this, and the Allied staff have to be very reactionary, which is quite a difficult thing to do.
It doesn't help, of course, that Wellington's constantly got his eye, for obvious reasons, on that potential for Napoleon to swing around his flank and cut off his communication with the Channel ports. And certainly when you look at the deployments for Quatre Bras and that initial sort of 24 hours of the campaign, when the British do, or the Anglo-Dutch army, we should say, do start to concentrate, Wellington seems to be quite hesitant to commit fully to move it to concentrate on Quatre Bras, because he has that concern that actually there might be that dive towards Mons. What's it like for Blucher?
Yeah, I mean, both the Allies have got their own individual sort of things to worry about. So, I mean, Blucher, their line of communication obviously back through Liège and up to Germany through that way. And that's something that Gneisenau is continuously worried about in terms of it. And I think Gneisenau, which we might come on to as we talk a bit more about the campaign later on, but one of the things he's got to worry about is his line of communication. And I think for Gneisenau, it's important to remember that he'd seen this happen many times before, whereas Wellington was obviously worried about it as well, and he had an understanding, but Gneisenau's come in for quite a lot of criticism for, worrying about supporting Wellington and whether that would lead to his line of communications being cut off. But I think that's a fairly legitimate worry when he'd seen it happen before. And, Prussia had been absolutely crushed in the past by poor decision-making and poor staff work. And Gneisenau was basically not knowing what was going to happen, had to really worry about his lines of communication as well. So essentially the Allies, between the two of them, were in a difficult situation, coming from basically almost exactly opposite directions in their lines of communication, meant that this was a big worry. And also famously, I think it's interesting with Napoleon's strategy of the central position, that usually occurred as part of ongoing operational movements within a campaign, where, for example, he had cut lines of communication before then switching to conduct the strategy of the central position. So it was reasonable to think that he'd maybe cut one of their lines of communication and then proceed to split the two armies, which I think is an important point to remember, that it's not as obvious that he should just launch in to try and split the two armies. It's actually probably more logical, like both Wellington and the Prussians sort of thought, that he would swing one way or the other to try and cut one of the lines of communication, which is an interesting what if of the campaign as well, because maybe that would have worked.
Absolutely, and I think that definitely kind of tempers Gneisenau's kind of skepticism of the Anglo-Dutch army, and makes that withdrawal to Wavre in the wake of Ligny so much more surprising, I always think, because actually in doing that, you have to sort of sacrifice a lot of the communication with Liège. So is it fair to say that it's the staffs in a large part that determine Allied victory in the campaign?
Yes, well, I mean, I think I would say that, wouldn't I? Because that's my... I've been spending a few years trying to research this in general. But I think the Waterloo campaign is a very good, if not the best example of where in Napoleonic warfare staff work is absolutely crucial. But I think in all campaigns it is absolutely crucial, and as crucial in all of them really. But it shows very much when problems start to happen and staffs don't function, that can really lead to a campaign unravelling, as it does for Napoleon. And I think, like one of your earlier questions, one of the big issues is overcoming problems that aren't necessarily foreseen, and how best staff work can react to that is a key point. And for the French, things really do unravel for Soult, and just basic staff work that should have been done in terms of sending duplications of orders is a real issue, which Berthier was actually famous for, in terms of units that didn't necessarily need to know what was happening everywhere, and would often be sent information of how units were moving that weren't to do with them, so they could at least have a good sort of situational awareness. Whereas Soult, not only does he not just tell units that don't necessarily need to know, he doesn't tell crucial people, most importantly, Ney, for example, what the situation is, which, doesn't actually take that much. He's got a whole series of staff officers working with him, so that their whole job is to copy orders and send duplicates. It's not an issue of time, it's an issue of thinking what needs to be done. And he really needed to have been keeping everyone afoot of the developments of the campaign, even if it was happening fast. Rather than sending one letter, you send the same letter to different people, and that was important. And basic things like the French staff having poor mounts is mentioned, in terms of riders delivering these messages, and obviously you've got the usual problems of people getting lost or killed, etc., which is unfortunate. But again, duplicate orders where you send the same order twice to the same person, etc., to make sure it gets through. All these things really unravel for the Allies. But I mean, there's also serious mistakes on unravel for Napoleon, sorry. But there's also serious mistakes for the Allies throughout the campaign. So it's not all one-sided. But Napoleon's staff really struggle with the campaign. I think that's a major issue that determines the campaign, and you can see this at a number of points throughout the 100 Days campaign that causes issues for Napoleon, and essentially chances that he may have had of securing victory in that theatre are sort of squandered away, unfortunately, mainly due to poor staff work.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite surprising that Soult makes that mistake of not duplicating messages, because he served in the Peninsula, where famously one of the reasons that Wellington had an advantage, there were a few of them, but was the fact that the guerrillas were often intercepting most, if not all, of the French communications. And so therefore, surely he must have kind of known of the need to duplicate correspondence and send multiple versions.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. And I think maybe Soult thought, as everything was happening in such close proximity for the 100 Days that, he could quickly get people up to speed with what was happening. Or I think Soult probably thought he had more control than he actually did in terms of, if something needed changing, he could be the one to react and change it. But and that wasn't worked, because Ney needed to know what was happening on his right in the distance away, and he obviously couldn't know from where he was, apart from the noise, what was happening. So it wasn't just, I think Soult thought he was in control when that wasn't his job. It was to make sure everyone knew what was going on, and he could at least direct things and just wouldn't react like a general could react in terms of changing his ideas. Soult's role was to keep everyone up to date with what was happening and keep the orders process going, rather than him, having some information, then starting to think about what to do. So I think it feeds back to Soult not understanding his role is quite different from being a marshal in command of an army to being a chief of staff, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. We've touched on this already. Napoleon famously stole a march on the Allies in the Waterloo campaign. And there was this dramatic, almost kind of cliche Hollywood-style moment where Wellington found out about the seriousness of Napoleon's advance. There had been rumours, obviously, earlier during the day. But he finds out at the Duchess of Richmond's ball. And the ball, for various reasons, seems to sort of feature quite prominently in the tale of Waterloo afterwards, and appears in almost every period drama. The most recent examples will be Vanity Fair and Belgravia. How important do you think the ball is in the story of the campaign, and how we kind of remember it?
Yeah, no, it's interesting how often the Duchess of Richmond's ball is features in the narrative and, as you say, period dramas. But I think, understandably, it's sort of romantic side of the story and how everything develops, and it's an interesting event that happens just on the eve of, as the campaign's already started. So I think naturally it fits into a lot of people's stories about Waterloo, and it is key to the campaign in terms of Wellington's there and hearing news and reacting to developments. But I think, in recent years there's been various revisions of our understanding of the ball. I mean, famously, there were other balls going on in Brussels, and it wasn't that unusual that a ball was happening. That's well known now. It was taking place in a coach house. That's well known now.
Wellington Road, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, it's it'd be good to be able to go and visit it these days, but it's unfortunate you can't. And also the thing about Wellington hearing the news, it's known, that Wellington was well aware before the ball even happened, that Napoleon was on the move and things were happening. It's just he found different bits of news. Famously, the Prince of Orange's ADC coming with more news is a key thing. And so there are also some important points about the ball that sometimes are sort of a bit overlooked or overplayed or whatever. But it certainly was the case that the Duchess of Richmond's ball was a sort of farewell ball for the army. And there are letters before the ball where people are going to the ball saying the Duchess of Richmond is hosting this ball for the army before it goes off on campaign. So a lot of people that say, this just interrupted one of the many balls that are happening in Brussels. It was understood that it was a farewell ball, but probably that the army would be moving on the 20th of June, so a few days later. But it wasn't the case that, there was just a series of balls that were interrupted by the news of Napoleon moving. I think also a lot of people tend to say that, everyone was there at the ball, and it was this, grand assembly of everyone who was important. But there was lots of people that were either invited that didn't attend the ball, or that didn't, attend for whatever reason, not being invited. And there were, a number of important people that didn't go. From my perspective, Delancey, who's invited, doesn't attend because he's busy knowing that Napoleon's started his campaign, trying to get everyone mobilised, ready for wherever they might need to move to. And this is also true with commanders at lower levels. So that it's not the case that everyone's there. And this also feeds into the thing about Wellington briefing up his commanders at the ball. Because obviously, I think most famously, but in most dramas as well, it's repeated, but famously in the 1970 film, Wellington has a series of an unusual selection of commanders that he has in his room for some reason, from different levels of command, from sort of battalion commanders up to corps commanders. But he, famously, they circle the map about him going to be at Waterloo, etc. But this isn't really the case of him doing a big briefing at the ball, because all he really does, from the accounts we have, there's one Coldstream officer who says about the Duke of Richmond and Wellington, just the two of them being in a room talking about the Waterloo position. But, the Duke of Richmond's basically got nothing to do with the campaign in the military sense. And there's no other commanders or senior staff officers present there. So this item, briefing people up, has been definitely overplayed in the past. Yes, he does speak to a few commanders individually at the ball, but there's no sort of grand, gathering of commanders that he then launches his campaign. It's very much him hearing the news, then, Delancey and the staff working through the night to get everyone moving is the key point, really. But yeah, I think the most important point is certainly that Wellington is surprised by how fast Napoleon has moved. And this goes back to my point I was saying about the tempo of the campaign. And I think that's the absolutely crucial point that we take from the ball, which is, Wellington being humbugged is a very true account of, he probably said that, but also it's certainly what had happened, because he knew Napoleon was moving long before the ball. Well, before the ball, he knew that he'd be moving. And the news that came, how far up he'd got, very much taken by surprise. So it was that's the importance really of the ball, I think, is the speed with which Napoleon's armies moved.
With all the officers having to go back to their regiments, do you think it was helpful in the sense that they took the news of how serious the situation was with them? Or do you think the delay that they actually had to go back to their units and had to go and find their units for the units to then be able to move go to the hindrance? Do you think that one kind of balances out the other, or is there anything in that?
I think from a staff work perspective, I don't think it really makes that much difference, because how much they actually knew what the news was coming. There wasn't a grand announcement about what had happened. And by the time a lot of those officers got back to their, a lot of them were based in and around Brussels anyway. By the time they got back, they were joining the troops that were moving anyway. And the orders for those troops to move to wherever they were going would have come from Delancey's headquarters. And so in reality, a lot of the officers, especially the more junior ones, will have just left the ball knowing something was happening. And then by the time they found their way to their formations, which were either already on the move or not even on the move yet, they would have heard, from a roundabout way, orders will have come into that formation that they then heard where they were going to. So I think it was sort of probably two separate things of, they knew something, but they certainly wouldn't have known where they were going, where they were going to, in terms of, different small positions in the in that theatre, and the orders will have come from Delancey to the different formations, and we hear of all the officers writing out duplications of the orders for the army to get moving and assemble it at assembly points. So I think the orders will have gone through Delancey, and they wouldn't have really heard from the ball itself.
And when we talk about vital turning points in the campaign, one of the favourite things to discuss is the sort of what ifs of Quatre Bras and Ligny and how they turn up differently. Staff work ends up being quite crucial for both, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Because obviously sort of twin battle going on both on the 16th, so it's a lot going on between the three armies, and the battlefields are, close enough to each other that they're very much affecting what's happening at each one. But starting with the British at Quatre Bras, or the Allies, I should say, obviously a crucial thing which is interesting, where someone manages to react without really staff work playing an important role in terms of they weren't authorised to, is obviously Saxe-Weimar's decision to stand at Quatre Bras, which is absolutely crucial to the campaign and how that develops. And Père Poncher reinforcing him with his 2nd Netherlands Division and, shoring up that position is absolutely crucial. One of the really interesting things I found relating to the Waterloo campaign in my PhD research is about who Père Poncher was. And he'd actually served in the British Army, firstly in Egypt, but before that he'd been dealing with British liaison officers who had been attached to the Archduke Charles's headquarters in the Austrian army for years before that. And that was probably how Lord Proby convinced Père Poncher to enter the British service. And he also served in the Blucher expedition. But before that, he'd served in the Corunna campaign, and interestingly, in the Quartermaster General's Department with Delancey and Hardage, the liaison officer with the Russian army. And Père Poncher, this campaign had been crucial for the development for the Quartermaster General's Department's way of working. Père Poncher will have known Delancey very well, but also the Allied system of working, and he took this crucial decision to back up Saxe-Weimar's brigade and shore up the position. And him and Delancey, and also Abercrombie of Prince of Orange's First Corps, Quartermaster General, they all knew how each other worked, and I think that was a crucial point, that the Allies were actually, there were various individuals who knew each other within that army, and it wasn't just a case of them being thrown together to completely work. But in terms of staff work, they don't actually have authorisation to stand there, but that's a crucial decision where they go against the decision. For the Prussians at Ligny, obviously Gneisenau's main priority is trying to get the Prussian army assembled. Obviously, Napoleon strikes Zieten first, and they're pulling back, and he's trying to pull the other 3 Prussian corps into Zieten, moving back to Ligny, and he has difficulty with Berlow's 4th Corps trying to bring them in. So there are various difficulties for the Prussians and trying to assemble their forces quick enough at Ligny. That's an issue, but I think obviously Napoleon has real issues with both these battles with staff work, because d'Erlon's corps famously is moving between the 2 battlefields and isn't involved in either battle, either sort of helping Ney to push up the road and get that vital line of communication between Quatre Bras and Ligny, but then even more importantly, really, he doesn't come crashing in on the Prussians at Ligny, which would have probably, in the least case, it would have definitely meant they'd have had to move to the east towards Liège, because they'd have been blocked by d'Erlon, who would have been on that side of them. But even more importantly, it may have even, struck a crushing blow on the Prussians, which would have really knocked them out, either in the short term or even the long term. And that the poor way in which d'Erlon's managed by Soult is really crucial to those 2 battles, which would have had an effect to either of them, especially against the Prussians at Ligny. So staff work's absolutely crucial for all the different armies in those battles, but the French really managed to mess that up the most in terms of staff work, which has a big impact on the campaign.
So where does the blame lie? Is that Napoleon? Is that Soult? Is that d'Erlon himself? Is it Ney?
Yeah, I mean, the fault really lies in breakdown of the system, full stop, because you get a lot of people getting involved with what D'Erlon should be doing, whereas the actual system should have been Berthier hearing Napoleon's thoughts and then directing all the different corps commanders how to operate, whereas D'Erlon's basically stuck in the middle of hearing messages, some messages sent directly from Napoleon, who's written in pencil, given it to one of his ADCs and told him to, give that to D'Erlon, whereas the system should really have been Soult at least knew what was happening, and in an ideal world actually was sending the orders himself. So Napoleon interrupting, again shows Napoleon's lack of trust in Soult, getting involved with that, and also Soult really messes up informing Ney of what the situation is, and whereas had Ney known, that D'Erlon was now desperately needed back at Ligny to, strike the final blow, then Ney may have understood what was going on a bit more. But obviously Ney just hears that D'Erlon's now not coming to support him, and he's absolutely furious because he doesn't know why this is or what's happened there. So I think Soult is really to blame, but there's also just the whole system is obviously fractured anyway. So I think, you could blame Soult, but the whole system isn't working very well.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Waterloo itself, because for Wellington, Wellington's force, the staff work on the surface at least seems to be fairly limited. Is that fair?
Yeah, so it's interesting. From a staff perspective, all three of the armies, the staffs are sort of working pretty much flat out to try and deal with the situation, and they've each got their own problems to deal with. But I think the British have got a lot of work to do, or the Allies. Wellington's army's got a lot of work to do, just as the other armies have. First and foremost, when Wellington realises that the Prussians are going to have to give way at Ligny, he has to sort of start organising his staff have to organise the withdrawal, which is a big issue. They do quite an effective job of this, using different routes to pull back to Mont Saint-Jean Ridge. And then from a staff works point of view, Delancey's really busy drawing up the Allied army in its order of battle, ready for the following day, obviously firstly into its bivouacs, and then ready for the next morning, how they'll actually form up. So all of this isn't just Wellington talking to commanders, it's all staff officers and different officers from different formations in the Quartermaster General's department receive their instructions and then have to assemble the army. So before the battle even starts, the Quartermaster General's department, as always, is really important in drawing up the order of battle, making sure everyone's where they should be. And there's quite a lot of, in the early stages of the battle, shifting around of troops to best place them. And then as the battle develops, all the major decisions, Delancey's involved with relaying what's happening, and whether it's sort of bringing up the heavy cavalry, for example. That's an order from the Quartermaster General's department. Interestingly, there's a good account of officers from the Quartermaster General's department actually setting out the checkerboard formation of the squares. So when the cavalry come to attack, obviously each individual unit forms its own square, but in the bigger picture of things, those squares have to be in that famous checkerboard formation so they can each fire on the cavalry. And it's the Quartermaster General's department that actually places the squares behind the ridge in the correct pattern that they can do that, which obviously needs a lot of coordination.
Absolutely, otherwise they'd fire on each other, wouldn't they?
Yeah, exactly. Or it'd be fairly ineffective in terms of they just couldn't fire because they were so close to each other. Yeah, so it's a really important point that they have to do. And also dealing with Allied units, the Brunswick Corps, for example, they have to deal with them and make sure they're all knowing what the system and how the system's going to work. So it's not just British units, there's all sorts of units they've got to deal with. And then importantly, the staff is obviously the liaison with the Prussians and how they're getting on coming across, which Muffling does a good job from the Prussian side of things, relating to Wellington, what's happening. Hardage, who's actually wounded on the 16th, the officer from the Quartermaster General's department with Blucher, he doesn't do such a good job in relaying what's happening from his side of things. But at least there is an understanding of what the Prussian developments are, and crucially that they've got the right side of Grouchy and his formation, and that understanding really, the battle in terms of what Wellington knows he has to hang on because the Prussians are soon going. So it's all that is done through staff work, and knowing that is crucial. And Delancey himself was mortally wounded at the battle, which is a major issue obviously for the Allies. And his deputy, Felton Harvey, takes over during the battle. But that's obviously a bit of a blow to from a practical sense, how the staff's working during the battle. And Felton Harvey, fairly inexperienced staff officer, although very experienced soldier, takes up the quartermaster general's one, which is something new that I sort of found out recently that's not normal. Most people confuse Felton Harvey being an ADC of Wellington's, which he becomes after the battle. He takes over as the department and has to run that in the general advance. At the end of the battle, he's directing how the advance happens while Napoleon is moving. His army's basically broken.
And when it comes to the Prussians, their focus, for obvious reasons, has to be moving men as swiftly as possible from Havre to Waterloo. Those listeners who will have read Bernard Cornwell's Sharp's Waterloo will remember that he suggests that Gneisenau deliberately delayed the arrival of the Prussians for fear that Wellington would break and run and the Prussians would kind of be caught up in the sort of anarchy that followed and be encircled by Napoleon. And as a result of that, he implies that Gneisenau ordered the units furthest away from Waterloo to march first, so it took longer for the Prussians to move off. Is there any truth in that?
I mean, there's elements of truth in the sense of, I don't really accept the idea that Gneisenau deliberately delayed the turn up for Waterloo. I mean, he did it for sort of actual practical reasons. It wasn't just a case of let's just hedge our bets. I mean, Gneisenau certainly had reservations about, whether the British or the Allies would, how closely they'd back up what the Prussians are doing. And he was very well aware in the past that, if he leaves his lines of communications open, that could be a very risky issue for the Prussians. And as you say, if Napoleon won and then turned on them, they'd be in a very difficult situation. But in terms of the delay, I mean, he decides to move Berlow's 4th Corps, which is the furthest from the battle, towards Waterloo. But this does have practical reasons. Most famously, the fact that they've not really been engaged means that they're the strongest corps. And by the time they do actually get to Waterloo, that's obviously a big strength in terms of, they're fresh for the fight. Although, having said that, Berlow's corps had done a lot of marching during the campaign, and so in that sense was sort of really quite a weak choice in terms of getting them to move quickly across pretty difficult terrain. So he chose to move Berlow's 4th Corps. Gneisenau's coming for criticism in terms of not getting the other corps to move out the way and to let them through. I mean, that's true. That's potentially an issue with the staff work for the Prussians, but how much that obviously does cause some delay, but how much it's a serious delay is probably a bit debatable. That it was very difficult going anyway. Even when they got through the formations that were in the way, it was the terrain that really caused issues, as well as the fire, blocking the way. That there was various different issues that caused the delay. So I think there certainly was a delay. Gneisenau was a bit wary of the Allies and Wellington and how much he'd back him up. But at the end of the day, Gneisenau was loyal to what happened, and Wellington had requested specifically 2 corps to join on his left flank, and the Prussians effectively do provide those 2 corps, one on his left flank and one coming basically in Napoleon's rear at Plancenoit. So, it may have taken slightly longer, but at least they did get there in the end. And I don't think Gneisenau deliberately delayed it because he was purely because he was wary. Just needed to get the best troops over there, and also make sure that he didn't leave himself too vulnerable. And that's fair enough. Any chief of staff that didn't do that would have been very seriously criticised. So I think being a little bit cautious and making sure everything happened, correctly was important. And there were some issues, but I don't think it was purely that he was just not willing to help the Allies and Wellington. So I think that's an unfair criticism, really.
Absolutely. I think it's important that we rehabilitate Massenet's reputation amongst sharp fans, because if nothing else, the move to Bath shows that he was prepared to support the Anglo-Dutch army, because of course at the point at which the army has to pull, the Prussian army has to pull back, Blucher had been knocked off his horse leading a cavalry charge. So there's this gap where they have to work out, what do we do? Do we pull towards Liège or do we pull back to Vav? And Gneisenau is a key player in that decision-making process.
Yeah, exactly. Luckily with the Prussian system, the chief of staff was quite a crucial person, but Gneisenau makes that crucial decision to move north rather than east. And that's on no one else's shoulders other than Gneisenau. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. I think with a lot of his decision making, there's been a lot, people have tried to work out whether he was trying to be loyal to Wellington or, on the other hand, disliked the British and therefore didn't want to help Wellington. But I think at the end of the day, Gneisenau was a highly professional staff officer who'd fought Napoleon for years and years and years. And his idea was, how do we best beat Napoleon? And there wasn't really anything more to it than that. He was trying to be a professional soldier who would achieve that the best he could. And he was trying to work out the best way of doing that. And the best way of doing that was to move north and be in contact with Wellington's army. So I think people tried to work out his motivations, but I think his overall motivation was, how do I best conduct this campaign? And the best way of doing that was staying in contact with Wellington's army and trying to support each other.
One of the mistakes on the Prussian side that people do play up quite a lot is the fact that a quarter of Thielmann's corps, which is the corps that was left behind to cover the Prussian rear from attack by Grouchy at Wavre, ended up marching off with the main Prussian army. How big an impact do you think that had in reality?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Grouchy has a very difficult day in terms of working out what he's meant to be doing, and he has, he thinks he's doing the right thing, but obviously everything turns out to go wrong. But whose fault that is another whole question. But yeah, the Prussian Third Corps, where interestingly Clausewitz is the chief of staff, they do obviously try and hold up Grouchy at Wavre and manage to effectively keep Grouchy from joining Waterloo. So I think at the end of the day, yes, there were certainly lots of smaller issues that went wrong for all the staff of all three armies. But at the end of the day, the Prussian Third Corps managed to keep Grouchy at bay from joining the battle, and that was their most important point, and also managed to stop them interrupting too much with the Prussian move over to support Wellington. So at the end of the day, yeah, there were maybe smaller elements that weren't, in hindsight, dealt with the best they could have been, but their overall objective was achieved of keeping Grouchy at bay from interfering with the Prussian move across.
Yeah, Thielmann's corps did remarkably well when you consider that on paper it looks to be the weakest of the four corps that Prussia fielded. When you look at the regiments that made up the corps, you've got 4 standard infantry regiments and then 6 of them are Landwehr, so they're effectively slightly better than militia, and it's had very little artillery. So Thielmann's corps did remarkably well to hold off a much larger force in Grouchy. Yes, okay, they had the river line, which helped with that process in terms of holding them back. But they equipped themselves fairly well. Yeah.
And also you can see, obviously, they have a good defensive position at Wavre, and Grouchy's force, is pushing them, and you can understand a bit more Gneisenau's issue of, if Napoleon does win the battle, which from Grouchy's point of view, he sort of thinks maybe Napoleon is winning the battle, and he, even reads potentially this message from Napoleon that he's won the Battle of Waterloo. That had that happened, Gneisenau would have been in a very difficult situation. His army would have been strung out, quite distances between Third Corps, as you say, trying to hold off Grouchy, and then Berlow's Corps at Planchenoit. So it'd have been pretty difficult had that happened. And you can understand, going back to an earlier question about how Gneisenau was worried about moving to support Wellington in the way that they did. I mean, it turned out well, but with the Third Corps rearguard action at Wavre, had they been trying to hold off Grouchy there, and then Napoleon had turned on a strung out army, could have been a very difficult situation for the Prussians. So Gneisenau had to very much gamble that it all paid off, and luckily it did.
So how close do you think Napoleon came to winning the campaign?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think Napoleon did come close in the early stages. The surprise with which he invaded Belgium, that was excellent. And the concept of the strategy of the central position was, pretty well. It was a pretty good idea. Whether he could have cut one of the lines of communication, as I say, may have potentially been another way of doing it. But his concept of the central position had worked so many times before. I think that was good. So on the 16th, where he had an encounter battle going on at Quatre Bras with Wellington's army, and he'd got the Prussians at Ligny, had d'Erlon's corps really been committed to knocking out the Prussians at Ligny, I think that was a key moment in the campaign, and where he came close to potentially knocking out at least one of the armies. I mean, who knows what would have happened afterwards. And then similarly, at Waterloo, Grouchy's force being quite a large force, just holding off the Prussians and not contributing, that was also difficult. And, Napoleon did come close to knocking Wellington off the ridge, had the Prussians not turned up. So if Grouchy had managed to either hold the Prussians away or maybe come to help, his crucial point would have been to hold the Prussians away, Napoleon could have won then as well. So I think both on the 16th and the 18th there were chances for Napoleon. It's a much bigger question of, had he won the campaign, what would have happened with all the Austrians and Russians coming. But I think that can sometimes be overplayed as well, in terms of it would have been a big blow if Wellington or Blucher had been defeated. The Allies would have definitely had to think again in terms of, these are very efficient commanders and, okay armies that were fighting. And if they'd been knocked out by Napoleon, that would have been a serious, blow to the 7th Coalition.
So what's the point where you feel he lost it? Because for me, I always kind of look at the wake of Ligny that evening, but then also the morning after, and question whether or not, after that opportunity had been lost, he'd almost driven that wedge between Wellington and Blucher. The Prussians hadn't defeated as much as he thought, but they were pulling back. He had that opportunity to either pounce on Wellington or pursue the Prussians potentially, and it all depends on how tight his forces were and so on, but potentially pursue the Prussians a bit more vigorously. For me, that's where the Waterloo campaign is lost, because by not capitalising on that situation, it gave the Prussians that time to pull back, gather themselves a little bit, and then move across to Port Wellington. And the fact that Wellington wasn't heavily engaged at Quatre Bras, albeit because they didn't really have the orders to do so, meant that Wellington was able to pull back himself and occupy the position at Mont-Saint-Jean, which he might not have been able to do had he been pursued, actively engaged at Quatre Bras. So for me, that's where it's won and lost. What's your reading of it?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one in terms of pinpointing exact points in the campaign where it's sort of won and lost. And I think it's a big question. Certainly agree that, there are issues. I think the biggest, for me, it's at Ligny, had d'Erlon's corps come crashing in to really knock out the Prussians. That was an absolutely crucial point.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well as on the 18th, if Grouchy had kept the Prussians away, that may have also been a crucial point as well. But I think overall, rather than a specific point, I think it was more the staff system itself was a large part to play in the overall what happened. And I think the weakness of Soult and the French staff system compared to the comparative effectiveness of the Allied staff systems, which had a lot of issues that didn't go well, and they had a lot of people that made difficult decisions that didn't always work out well. But I think at the end of the day, it's who managed to do the best in a difficult situation in terms of the different staffs, and the French really struggled to coordinate what was needed at the various, as you say, different points where he may have won the campaign. At each of those, the staff was crucial in meaning that they weren't executed as well as they should have been. So I think, at the different points, it often comes down to poor staff work that prevented chances that may have worked out from actually coming off.
Potentially, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, it could have been so much different if Berthier had sided with Napoleon.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's a famous quote where Napoleon famously, blames the fact or laments about the fact that Berthier wasn't there, and that may have been why he lost. And I know, critics of Napoleon, may say, Napoleon's looking for any sort of excuse to explain why he didn't win, but at the end of the day, he didn't win. But I think, even outside of who Napoleon was and how he didn't admit to a lot of his flaws, I think even with that in mind, Berthier was so crucial to how Napoleon's army had worked since the 1796 campaign in Italy. Had been absolutely crucial. Had Berthier been there, I'm not saying Napoleon would have won. There was a number of issues that still had to be overcome. It was a very difficult situation, but I think Napoleon would have had a much more better chance of winning, at least. And certainly things have been very different. I mean, like we keep saying about the d'Erlon's Corps, that just wouldn't have happened. They would have been committed to one or the other of the battles had Berthier been there, and various other decisions during the campaign that would have gone a lot smoother had Berthier been there. So, I think it would have helped Napoleon, and who knows whether he'd have won or not.
And just to finish off, what does Waterloo mean to you personally?
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, it's the culmination of the Napoleonic Wars, which is such a fascinating period, and really sums up a lot of the issues that have been going on throughout those wars. And from a staff point of view, the typical frictions of war and how so many issues can impinge on how a campaign develops. So I think Waterloo is a really good example of that. Waterloo is really interesting and important in terms of Britain's standing in the world and in Europe, because when the Congress of Vienna, continues after the 100 Days, Britain's in a very different situation to how it had been before the 100 Days started, and it got the key things it needed, such as the balance of power in Europe, and that basically, and its own standing in Europe, and that basically set it up for sort of global expansion after Waterloo. So Waterloo is an absolutely crucial moment in sort of British history, and similarly for the other countries, Prussia, going back right to Jena and Austerlitz in 1806, being humiliated, but Waterloo being the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where Prussia had beaten the French. But this set up, a long rivalry between France and Germany that would eventually continue into the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, and beyond that. So I think that's crucial. And France's cultural history as well is important with Waterloo in terms of going back to the French Revolution, but also the Napoleon legend, and Waterloo massively feeds into that. So I think a big part of French identity, Waterloo, is really important. And it's just overall a defining moment in European history. So I think, and Waterloo is very important for a whole number of reasons, not just staff work.
Absolutely. Well, it's been so good to have you on and to talk through such a complex system that had so much impact on the way in which the Waterloo campaign unfolded. Thank you so much for joining me, Waterloo Remembered.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for having me, Zach.
That was the historian Will Fletcher joining me to discuss the 3 styles of command during the Waterloo campaign. You can follow Will online on Twitter at 1815 Fletcher. There's loads of content being released today as part of the Waterloo Remembered programme. Remember that today our live tweets of the campaign have started, giving you an insight into what was happening in real time 205 years ago. We're also starting the Voices from the Battlefield series, the 41 readings of eyewitness testimony from across the campaign and from so many perspectives: British, Dutch, Prussian, Belgian, French, soldiers, civilians. You can catch it all here on the Napoleon Assist, and today we're releasing the first 10 of those eyewitness accounts, so make sure you have a listen to those. Also remember that we want you to get involved in the discussion online, either in the forum at the napoleonicwars.net, where there is that dedicated Waterloo Remembered room, or you can post on Twitter. Remember to use the hashtag Waterloo Remembered and share your thoughts on what Waterloo means to you, why you think the battle matters. Ask your questions. Remember to tag Will if you have questions about what he said in today's interview. And if you've been to the battlefield, share your experiences. Perhaps post some photos. If you know of a Waterloo veteran's grave near you, then post a photo, and again use that hashtag Waterloo Remembered so that we can all come together to be a part of this remembrance special. There won't be an interview tomorrow because we're going to focus specifically on the Voices from the Battlefield releases, and of course those live tweets will continue as we focus on the battles of Quatre Bras and Ligny, which were so crucial to how the Waterloo campaign unfolded. On the 17th, I will be back with an interview with Beatrice de Graaf and Jacqueline Reiter on Waterloo's legacy, so make sure you join us for that. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been Waterloo Remembered from the Napoleon Assist. Take care, my friends. Stay safe. And as ever, thank you for listening.
Even on a budget, quality is non-negotiable. That's why Quince is the place to score high-end essentials at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Get your hands on buttery soft cashmere sweaters from just $60, Italian leather jackets, and so much more. And the best part about Quince, they exclusively partner with factories committed to safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Elevate your style without the elevated price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Cats and cat owners deserve better than any old-fashioned litter. That's why I teamed up with scientists and veterinarians to create Pretty Litter. Its innovative crystal formula has superior odor control and weighs up to 80% less than clay litter. Pretty Litter even monitors health by changing colors to help detect early signs of potential illness. It's the world's smartest kitty litter.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.